Going over absolute and comparative advantage. Now, this video and videos in the future are going to be a little bit different from my previous videos. My previous videos kind of simplified and boiled things down from AP Microeconomics or AP Macroeconomics. These videos are going to be just for everyone, for people in college, for people wanting to learn just for fun. These are just simple economics topics that I think you should definitely know. So first, let's talk about absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is when we have two different countries and they're producing products. Absolute advantage is whoever can produce the most of a product. So let's look at this example. We have the United States and Canada and how many cars and maple syrup they can produce. The United States can produce 50 cars and 50 maple syrups, while Canada can produce 10 cars and 100 maple syrup. So, who has the absolute advantage? Well, the United States can produce 50 cars, Canada can produce 10, so the United States has an absolute advantage in producing cars, because they can produce the most cars. Then in maple syrup, the United States can produce 50 maple syrups, Canada can produce 100, so Canada has an absolute advantage. It's fairly simple. With absolute advantage, a country can have 2 absolute advantage, they could have 0 absolute advantages, they can have 1. It all depends. For example, the United States could produce 200 maple syrups. Then they would have 2 absolute advantages. Just here, we have 1 for each country. Now, to understand the next topic we're going to be covering, comparative advantage, you need to understand opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is a cost for taking a specific action or chance. And when people hear that out loud, they don't really understand it. But just take this example. Let's say we have an exam tomorrow, an economics exam, but you decide to go to a party and not study. The opportunity cost of going to that party is getting a good grade on the exam. Because instead of going to that party, we could have just stayed in our dorm, or we could have stayed in our house and studied for our actual exam and got a good grade. That's the opportunity cost of going to a party. So opportunity cost is simply the cost of an action when you could have done something else, really. Now, comparative advantage is a little bit more different than absolute advantage. Comparative advantage is simply the country that has the lowest opportunity cost of producing a product. So let's actually calculate that. Same example here, but let's calculate a comparative advantage. So how do we calculate opportunity cost is the most important part? Well, let's think about it. If the United States can produce 50 cars and 50 maple syrups, then that means we can produce 51 cars and 49 maple syrups if we just changed our production. In fact, if we can produce 50 cars and 50 maple syrups, then I bet we could produce 100 cars and 0 maple syrups. So, if that's possible, then the opportunity cost of 1 car is 1 maple syrup. Because if we produce 1 more car, we lose 1 maple syrup. So the simple way of calculating it is if we're calculating the opportunity cost of the United States producing a car, we take maple syrup, which is 50, and divide it by the amount of cars. So 50 divided by 50 is 1. So the opportunity cost here is 1. Then let's calculate the opportunity cost of Canada. They can produce 10 cars and 100 maple syrups. So let's do the same formula we did just there. Take 100, divide it by 10. Boom, our opportunity cost is 10. For each car we produce, we lose or gain 10 maple syrups. So that's how we can calculate opportunity cost. But let's actually reverse it. Let's find the opportunity cost of 1 maple syrup. Well, what's the opportunity cost of that? Same formula, but reverse it here. 50 divided by 50, so 50 is the amount of cars. We divide it by maple syrup, we get 1. That's not really the most useful example, but let's look at Canada. They can produce 100 maple syrups, 10 cars. So how can we find the opportunity cost of 1 maple syrup? Well, 10 divided by 100, and then we get 0.1. So to calculate the opportunity cost, you take the other product that the country is producing and divide it by the product we're finding. So 50 divided by 50, 100 divided by 10 to find the opportunity cost for cars in the United States and Canada. For maple syrup, you take 50 divided by 50 for the United States and 10 divided by 100 for Canada. So what has the lowest opportunity cost? Well, the United States has an opportunity cost of 1 for a car. Canada has 10. So the United States is lower, so they have a comparative advantage. Then let's calculate Canada. Let's calculate maple syrup. For the United States, it's 1 to 1. For Canada, the opportunity cost of one maple syrup is 0.1 cars. So Canada is lower, so they have a comparative advantage. So the United States has a comparative advantage in cars, and Canada has a comparative advantage in maple syrup. Always note, for the absolute advantage, you can have two absolute advantages. The United States could produce more cars and more maple syrup. But for comparative advantage, you can only have one. You can't have two, you can't have zero, it's always one. So if we find out the United States has a comparative advantage in cars, that means Canada must have a comparative advantage in maple syrup. If let's say the United States had a comparative advantage in maple syrup, well, that means Canada must have a comparative advantage in cars. A country cannot have two, they cannot have zero. So now let's calculate let's find an easier way to actually solve this. I and many others call it the quick and dirty method. It's basically an easier way of finding the comparative advantage without all this complicated stuff. So the way we do it is by multiplying the diagonals and seeing what number is bigger. So let's actually try that. If we multiply these two diagonals, 50 times 100, we get 5,000. Multiply these two diagonals, we get 50 times 10, that's 500. 5,000 is bigger than 500, so the comparative advantage is the United States in cars and Canada with maple syrup, the two different boxes that we multiplied. So it's whatever number is bigger, and then that's the comparative advantage. So let's actually practice all of this. Pause the video and do the question, look and see if you can get this correct. Now that you've probably and hopefully answered this question, let's look at it. The table below, or I guess above, shows how many bananas and avocados Canada and Mexico can produce. Which of the following is true about Canada and Mexico? So, Canada has an absolute advantage in both products. Let's see. Canada can produce 100 bananas, Mexico can produce 80 bananas. That's definitely true. Canada has an absolute advantage in bananas. But Canada can only produce 200 avocados, Mexico can produce 400. So Canada does not have an absolute advantage in avocados, so A is not correct. Mexico has a comparative advantage in both products. We already know that's just wrong. You can't do that. That's not possible. C, Mexico has a comparative advantage in bananas. Let's actually figure this out. Let's do the quick and dirty method. Multiply these two diagonals. 400 times 100, that's 40,000. 200 times 80, that's 16,000. So what's bigger? 40,000 is bigger. So what's the comparative advantage? Canada and bananas, because that's the one we multiplied, and Mexico and avocados, because that's also the one we multiplied. So C is also incorrect, because Mexico does not have a comparative advantage in bananas. Mexico has an absolute advantage in bananas. Let's see. No, they don't. Canada produces 100 bananas, and Mexico produces 80. And finally, Mexico has an absolute advantage in avocados. That is correct, because Mexico can produce 400, Canada can produce 200. So now that's just the gist of absolute and comparative advantage. The necessary stuff you need to know for an economics class, for general knowledge, and for much more. If you want more practice, in the description, there will be a more in-depth video, AP Microeconomics Unit 1, where we cover more on absolute and comparative advantage, but also opportunity cost and much more, so that you can better understand this entire unit and all of these different concepts.